What's up guys, I'm here with the PokerWeasel.com organizer sheet. We're going to be taking a look at the Mindset and Sessions tab. In this tab we can keep track of the sessions that we've played along with our mindset. This will be especially useful if you're playing on a room that doesn't support trackers, but even if you play in a room that supports trackers, it can sometimes be worth taking a manual log of results so we can see how it correlates to our mindset. The Mindset tab is broken into two sections. We have the daily log over on the left hand side. Over on the right hand side we have the Mindset log. Unlike the daily log, the Mindset or mental game log is not designed to be filled in daily, but rather any time we pick up on some sort of revelation regarding our mental game. Let's start off with the categories on the daily log. So we have the date, fairly self-explanatory, and the weekday. Now this might seem like an irrelevant value at first, but remember, for most of us, days of the week are not equal. It could be that we are better rested at the weekend, or it could be the games are softer at the weekend. We may notice some patterns between which day of the week it is and the state of our mindset. So it's worth thinking about this as an important variable. Number of hands. Sometimes players find that the quality of their mindset may share some correlation with the number of hands played. For example, once we surpass a certain number of hands played in a session, it could be that we're prone to tiredness or lack of concentration, which is going to degrade our mindset. We may find that there's an ideal number of hands to be playing per session, where we maximize our volume but still maintain a healthy mindset. The limit played can definitely affect our mindset. The idea here is that if a limit is low enough that it doesn't really interest us, we're not going to be stimulated by the action, we are going to be prone to various types of mindset issues such as boredom or lack of concentration. Whereas if the limit's too high, it's maybe too challenging for us, or maybe it's outside the current depth of our bankroll, we're not going to be playing our A game in that case. We then have the win-loss column. That should be fairly self-explanatory, and the dollars per 100 hands, which is going to be calculated automatically. Let's say, for example, we've played 1,000 hands. Total win amount is $100. I can see the dollars per 100 hands, $10 per 100 hands. We can also select our limit, although this is not going to factor into the calculation. Now we can think about the following variables. Length of the session. As we mentioned earlier, sessions that are overly long may not produce the best results. We want to try and use this column to determine the appropriate length of a session for us, where we're most likely to play at our A game. And remember, once we pick up some kind of revelation regarding what's best for our mental game state, it's then that we jump on over to the right hand side of the sheet and start filling in our mental game revelations. Length is calculated in minutes. Let's say, for example, we play a 2-hour session, we'll put 120. We then have the difficulty rating of the session. Now this explicitly refers to mindset. For most of us, the better we run, the easier a session is on our mindset. If we are running bad, card dead, constantly being sucked out on, this is going to be a difficult session in terms of mindset. The difficulty score is a value between 1 and 10, where 1 is that was a very easy session, perhaps constantly being dealt premiums, constantly flopping well and making big hands, not being sucked out on. Whereas 10 is that was a very difficult session, we were perhaps card dead, running bad, getting cooled. Now the reason why it's important to assign a difficulty rating is that once we get onto the mindset score, the mindset score being another score between 1 and 10, where 1 was our mindset was pretty terrible, and 10 being our mindset was perfect, it's really important that we don't analyze that mindset score in a vacuum. It's not really that difficult to have a mindset score of 10 when the difficulty rating of the session was 1. Whereas if the difficulty rating of the session was 7, then it might actually be a good achievement to have a mindset of 8. So to help reflect this, just for fun, we have this session score column, which gives us a number of points for our mindset that session. Now the values which are used to create the mindset score are the difficulty, the mindset, and the session length. So if we just experiment, we have a difficulty of 1 and we have a mindset of 10. Well, it's not really too much of an achievement to have a mindset of 10. Okay, we couldn't have had a better mindset than 10, but it's not too hard to have a good mindset when everything's running well for us. We can see session score 12 for our mindset. Now let's say it was a slightly tougher session. Let's say the difficulty rating is 6. We can now see our session score jumps up to 72. And if the difficulty was 10, we can see the session score is 120. So if we were to have a relatively difficult session and not do so well on our mindset, but just about manage to pull through, we can see score of 57. That's more of an achievement than having a really easy session and then having quite a good mindset. The resultant score is proportional to the length of the session played. So if we imagine we have a session score of 48 over 120 minutes, well, if we halve the length of this session, so it's only 1 hour, we can now see that our session score is 24. It's true as well that the longer a session is, the tougher it is to maintain a high quality mindset throughout that entire session. Probably most of us may not struggle to play a 15-minute session where we are operating with a perfect mindset, but to play a 3-hour session operating with a perfect mindset, well, that deserves a higher session score. So think about this as just being for informational purposes only. It doesn't necessarily prove anything, but it's just a feedback system based on how well we've done with our mindset given the parameters described here. As part of our daily log, we can also keep track of our sleep hours. Now, this might seem at first glance like it's unrelated to poker, but it will have a pretty big impact, whether we get enough sleep, whether we get good quality sleep. And this is one of the reasons why having a daily log where we actually track the day of the week could be important. We might find, for example, that we get more or less sleep at the weekends, which then translates into a higher mindset score on certain days of the week. And our goal is to reproduce our A game as much as possible. So if you find a certain amount of sleep time is optimal for us, we want to try and reproduce that as much as possible so that we can play our A game as much as possible. It's very simply a case of selecting a sleep time in the first column and then selecting a wake up time in the second column. The sheet will then automatically calculate the duration for us. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean too much on its own, but what we might find is that there are certain patterns. For example, every time our sleep duration is below a certain amount, we're much more likely to have a low mindset score for that day. And that tells us that there is a minimum threshold on sleep duration for optimal performance. And if we get less sleep than that, we're risking not being able to play our A game on that day. The comments section is just for general comments regarding the session that was played on that day. At the moment, we have a selection of numbers which might feel somewhat abstract, whereas here is our opportunity to add some more detail regarding the session. So for example, if we had a difficulty rating of 10, why was that such a difficult session? We can write the reason here in the comments. If we managed to have a good mindset score, despite the fact that it was a difficult session, how did we manage to achieve that? What parameters were in place that caused us to play our A game despite facing a lot of variance in the session? Or alternatively, perhaps we played quite badly in the session, so our mindset score wasn't good. We need to write some comments in terms of what happened to our mindset. What were some of the strategic adjustments that we erroneously made as a result of having that bad mindset? As we fill out this comment cell, we'll hopefully draw some overall conclusions or some links between the parameters we've recorded and the quality of our mental state. Once we draw these conclusions or revelations regarding our mental game, it's now time to move on over to the table on the right hand side. So we won't necessarily fill this table out every day, but we will fill it out every time we learn something new about our mental game. Now it's divided into 3 sections. So we have the first 2 columns which deal with C game, the next 2 columns which deal with A game or playing in the zone as it's often known, and then we have the final 2 columns which are a plan going forward for how to either deal with a C game issue or how to reproduce our A game at a higher frequency by thinking about the habits which result in our A game being played at a higher frequency. So firstly, C game signs. This column is for indications that we're not playing our A game. Sometimes players are playing their C game and they don't even realize it. If you asked them, they would tell us that they were playing their A game, when in fact they're playing their C game. So the first step for us is to actually recognize that we're even playing our C game to begin with. Now for each of the rows in this table, it's recommended to fill out one of the first 4 columns and one of the last 2 columns, sometimes 2 of the last 2 columns, depending on what the issue is. But most of these rows are just going to have 2 columns filled in. To give some example C game signs, one might be 3-betting more aggressively. Perhaps this happens when we get stuck, we start 3-betting more, even if it's subconsciously, in the hopes of chasing our losses. Another example could be a thought process. It doesn't have to be a manifestation in our strategy. For example, we might think something along the following lines. What's the point of playing poker if I always lose against the fish? You'll find that you think certain types of things periodically at certain points. So whenever this particular thought process flashes across your brain, that's a telltale sign that we're no longer playing our A game. And we can then think about some of the other manifestations of that. To give an example of how the flowchart might work in this case. First of all, this thought process flashes across our brain. What's the point of playing poker? I've just been sucked out on by a fish. What's the point of playing if I can't even beat the fish? Then the next thing we'll be thinking about is some of our other C game manifestations. For example, we know we're now playing our C game because of this thought process that's occurred in our brain. We now need to counteract the fact that we're going to tend towards 3-betting more aggressively than we should. So the next thought that crosses our brain is, okay, I'm playing my C game. I'm probably going to try and 3-bet more aggressively than I should at this stage. I want to preempt that and counteract that before it becomes a reality. Whereas if we don't realize we're playing our C game, we're playing our C game and we think we're playing our A game, then suddenly 3-betting more aggressively, we're going to be blindsided by that. We're not even going to realize that we're going to tend towards doing that until it's too late. The sooner we realize we're playing our C game, the sooner we can begin to preemptively adjust against some of the other C game manifestations. As we mentioned, for each row, we're going to fill in one value of these first 4. We're then going to think about filling in one of either the logic or plan columns. The logic column is for us to create a logical statement or a logic bomb, something that we can rehearse beforehand and inject into our thought process at the relevant moment. And partly it revolves around debunking the C game signs. So if we take that second sign, this thought process, what's the point of playing poker if I always lose against the fish? Well, in reality, we probably don't always lose against the fish. We need to remind ourselves that. Let's write here in the logic field, we actually have higher profit margins versus the recreational players than versus the regs. We only lose versus the recreational players over the short term. Now, just in terms of layout functionality, this obviously doesn't look too great at the moment, so first step might be to expand the column downwards. That might help. Next thing is to go to text wrapping and then choose the wrap option. You can then see that the text now takes up some vertical space instead. A little bit better layout for us. We think about that first issue, 3-betting more aggressively. Logic, although we might increase our win rate in the short term by 3-betting more aggressively, we actually damage our long-term win rate. So it doesn't make sense. So once we feel ourselves wanting to 3-bet more aggressively, we can just remind ourselves of that. Okay, you might win a few short-term pots, but what we're doing overall is actually not good for our win rate. So let's return now to the C game triggers. So C game signs were manifestations that we're playing our C game as opposed to our A game. C game triggers are the things that cause us to fall out of our A game and start playing our C game. So once we realize that we're playing our C game based on the C game signs, the next logical question is, what caused us to fall out of our A game and start playing our C game? So it could be something simple like facing bad beats, could be card dead. Many players can handle one bad beat, but it's a chain of bad beats that actually serves as a trigger to push them into playing their C game. So we might identify that a C game trigger for us is 3 or more bad beats in a session. So the way that we can utilize this information is, once we see a trigger occurring, we know that we're going to be facing increased likelihood of playing our C game, which then, as we mentioned earlier, allows us to preemptively try and counteract some of the C game signs we anticipate occurring based on the fact that we are facing a C game trigger. Another example of a C game trigger could be lack of sleep causing concentration issues. Now the reason why we picked this as an example C game trigger is because although one of these involves a logic statement, the other involves a plan. Let's think about 3 or more bad beats in a session. Well, the logic here is we know poker is a game that entails a high amount of variance. It's impossible to avoid multiple bad beats in the short term. And one thing I like to just keep in mind here is that besides, if it weren't for variance, there would be a lot fewer fish in the player pool. So one of the things that keeps recreational players coming back is they know that there is a possibility that they can win, even if it's just a function of variance. They might win over 10k hands, 20k hands. Whereas if it's a game like chess, for example, the weaker player nearly always loses. And if poker was like that, the weaker players would go broke very fast. There would only be very strong players in the player pool. So we're actually thankful for the variance aspect of poker because it means that weaker players are consistently coming to the tables thinking that they have a chance of winning, which they do over the short term. Now that's clear that it involves a logical statement. So we just want to think more logically about that scenario, but that's not the same for lack of sleep causing concentration issues. So there's no point trying to will ourselves to play our A game if we very simply haven't had enough sleep. So it's pointless filling out this logic section. In fact, the only way we can really resolve this particular mindset issue is by creating a physical plan. In most cases, the solution here is relatively obvious. Think about a sleep schedule that ensures we get at least, and then you can input whatever the amount of required sleep is per night, and you might have an idea of that based on your daily log. Let's just say 7 hours. Think about a sleep schedule that ensures we get at least 7 hours sleep per night. Avoid playing on days when sleep deprived, perhaps. So hopefully this illustrates the difference between the logic component and the plan. It doesn't make sense to have a logic component for lack of sleep. We need a physical plan to solve that problem. Now let's look at zone observations and zone parameters. To help us understand what these columns mean, we could think about them as A-game signs and A-game triggers. In essence, these are the same 2 columns as the first 2, but they deal with A-game, or playing in the zone, rather than C-game. Zone observations is anything that indicates to us that we're currently playing our A-game. Playing in the zone, or playing in our A-game, is a little bit like being inside a bubble. And the reason why that particular analogy is often drawn is that bubbles are quite fragile things by nature. And sometimes the very act of realizing that we're in the bubble, the zone bubble as it's sometimes called, can actually cause that bubble to burst. So being familiar with the zone observations or A-game signs, it allows us to hopefully realize that we're playing our A-game without affecting the structural integrity of that zone bubble. Experience of the zone, or flow state as it's sometimes called, can be subjective to an extent. For example, sometimes players talk about time speeding up. Other times players talk about time slowing down. As we can see, it's not the same for everyone. There's going to be a measure of subjectivity here. But the idea is, what constitutes for you playing your A game? How do you know that you're playing your A game? Write your observations here. So let's type time seems to move more quickly than normal. Our decisions seem easy. and we are able to execute relatively complex lines without too much difficulty. Now, you might think, why does it matter if we recognize whether we're in the zone or not? So long as we're not playing our C game, that's the most important thing, right? Not exactly. Remember, our overall goal here is to reproduce our A game or playing with flow state as much as possible. And in order to understand which parameters generate that flow state, we need to be able to understand whether we were in a flow state during a particular session or whether we were playing an A game during a particular session. It's no good if at the end of the session we played an A game or we played in the zone for the entire session, but we have no idea at the end of it that we were playing in the zone. We can't then stop and think, well, what led to me playing in the zone on that particular occasion, because we didn't even realize we were playing an A game. Now with the zone observations column, as soon as we reach the end of a session where we were playing in the zone, we can then evaluate the parameters that led to us playing our A game. So for example, if we find that we need a certain amount of sleep, or if we find that we play better on a certain day of the week, or if we find that we play better on a certain time of day, or perhaps we find that we play better against certain types of opponents, perhaps we find that we play our A game when there are limited distractions. There are a whole host of things that can contribute to us playing our A game at a higher frequency. Sometimes it can be habitual. Certain types of activity cause us to play our A game at a higher frequency. Could be something like running a warm-up exercise before the start of each session. We spend maybe 5 to 10 minutes reviewing hands that were played, and those hands should be based on a specific topic. We might find that if we run that warm-up exercise, we're reaching the zone at a much higher frequency than sessions where we don't run that warm-up exercise. Well, that's a zone parameter. We are more likely to reach the zone if we run a 5 to 10 minute warm-up before each session. Well, now we have one of our zone parameters. So if that's really true, if we increase the frequency of A game play by running a 5 to 10 minute warm-up session, well, that needs to be part of our plan, right? Again, this is not logic. We don't want to inject logic here. We actually want to create a plan. Create a schedule for what our warm-up activity will look like for each session. Don't miss any warm-ups. So now that we understand the importance of the warm-up, now we understand that it's one of our zone parameters. It contributes to reaching our A game at a higher frequency. Part of our plan should be to not exclude that from our routine. And what can happen here is we start to see association between two events. So we start to associate that 5 to 10 minute warm-up with playing in the zone. That essentially causes us to generate a habit. And the habit is when we run that 5 to 10 minute warm-up, we reach the zone. And the longer that habit exists, the more strongly ingrained it becomes, to the point where we can now achieve the zone at a very high frequency just by reproducing the zone parameters that we've associated with playing in the zone. And sometimes it doesn't even have to be a poker-related activity. Any of the activities that we perform right before a session can become part of our zone routine. And we use the term zone routine to describe any of the activities that now have that habitual relationship with playing in the zone, whereby when we perform that activity, we're habitually and automatically preparing ourselves to play in the zone because that association between those two events has been established. Sometimes players think that playing in the zone is something that just happens at random. Hopefully this session has shown you that it's not something that has to happen randomly, but it's something that can be scientifically reproduced following this particular methodology. Alright, thanks for watching guys. Hope you enjoyed the Mindset and Sessions tab. Remember, you can pick up the PokerWeasel.com organizer at www.pokerweasel.com.